Good evening. Welcome to tonight's shiur. It's Sunday of Parshas Chukas. Let's go straight into our questions. We'll go one by one. Bez Hashem, interesting stuff. Question number one. So we have well-known Rashi in Chumash, which says that one should patronize a fellow Jew. So here we have the pasuk in Parshas Bahar, "V'chi simkaru mimkor la misecho." When you'll sell something to your friend, to your fellow, or ikonoi miyada misecho, or if you purchase from your fellow, al toinu ish es amisa. You should not cheat, not overcharge, etc. Okay. So of course the literal message of the pasuk is to be honest and not to overcharge or to underpay when you buy something. That's the din of oino, of causing pain to another person, in this case through financial dishonesty. But then, since the Torah uses the words konoi miyada misecho, so let's take a look in Rashi. We have the literal meaning. We have also a drasha, a further understanding, a deeper understanding, or alternative understanding. When you sell an article, sell it to a Jew who is your colleague. So I missed out a word. Minayin, from where do we know that when you're selling something, you should sell it, give first refusal to your fellow Jew? Talmud loymar, this we have the pasuk, if you are selling something, give the priority lamitecho, to a fellow Jew. Or binayin shim baso liknois, when it comes, you want to buy something. You have to buy the same goods. You can buy it from a goy, buy it from a yid. So then, how do you know that you should buy it from a Jew? You should buy from your fellow Jew. All right, so we have here this idea that whether I'm selling or buying, if it's possible that if there is a choice between a Jewish client, a Jewish provider, or an un-Jewish one, we should go for the Jewish client or the Jewish provider. This is the source of Rashi here, is from what's called the Sifra. The Sifra is the Braise, which is on Sefer Vayikra. So just to explain briefly what this means. In Gemara, we have very often, we know the Mishnah, and then we have the Braise, we have the Tosefta, which are like parallel texts. So let's say you have Shabbos, you have 24 chapters in Mishnah Shabbos, and you got, let's say some 20, I don't remember exactly how many chapters in the Tosefta, and you'll read there texts which are similar topics to the Mishnah, and they will be often quoted in the Gemara. It's another record of the same conversation, the same discussion, same halacha. But that's all in these topics. Like in the Mishnah is set out in topics, the 6 Sidorim of the Mishnah, and then we have each section, each Masechta. So these are in topics. Then we have a Braisa, which is like a companion to the Chumash. So instead of going in topics, it goes according to the order of the Psukim of the Torah. So we have primarily on Sefer Vayikra, we have it's either called Sifra, which is short for Sifra Deveirav. It's sometimes also referred to as Torah's Koyanim. So that's the Braisa on Sefer Vayikra. We have then on Sefer Bamidbar and Dvorim. In Yiddish, it's called the Sifri. The more correct pronunciation would be Sifrei, and the full word term would be Sifrei Deveirav or Sifrei Deveirav. That's the Braisa, which is along a companion to Bamidbar and Dvorim. And then we have the Braisa, which is on Sefer Shmois. So that's called the Mechilta. These are the primary halacha Braisas. So we've got Braisas which are companions to the Mishnah, and then we've got brises which are companions to the Chumash. So this Rashi is actually quoting from the Sifra. Why am I telling this? That the Sifra is actually a halachic source, which therefore begs the question, this idea that you should prioritize when you have an option to buy or sell, and should do trade with a fellow Jew, whether it's not brought in Shulchan Aruch. So very strange. Not in Rambam, not in Shulchan Aruch. To say that it was there, it was left out because of worrying about causing anti-Semitism. That's a possibility. It's a possibility, but it still remains strange. Rambam seems to be less affected by this concern. At any rate, it does beg the question, and how much? And more, this is really our discussion now. How much are you obliged to pay more in order to have a Jewish customer, or the other way around, or to buy from a Jewish provider? How much, if the same product is available from a Jewish provider and from a non-Jewish provider, how much more are you expected to pay in order to get the same product from a non-Jewish provider? That's really a question which we're dealing with today. So, as I said, it's not discussed in Shulchan Aruch. Rav Moshe Isserles, who lived about 450 years ago, he wrote the tablecloth on the Shulchan Aruch, the mappa. In other words, he filled in where minhag Ashkenaz is different to the Shulchan Aruch of the Rabbi Yosef Karo, who was a Sephardi. So he, in his response, he talks about this, and he takes it as for sure that the fact that it's going to cost more, there's going to be it shouldn't be relevant, because we see elsewhere, what should you do with the carcass of an animal which died of natural causes? So it says about a nevela. It says, either give it to the geir, I think the geir toisha, whatever it may be, or sell it to an ochri. So there's a preference to give it away to the geir rather than to sell it to the goy. So even though obviously if you sell it to the goy, you're going to make more money than if you give it away, and still the Torah expects you to prioritize giving it to the ger before selling it to the goy. So there are more saying the fact it's going to cost more is irrelevant. However, others disagree with the Ramah, and they say that in the context where it says that you have this carcass, and you should preferably give it to a ger rather than sell it to a goy, that would be talking about a ger who is eligible for tzedakah. And therefore, there's a mitzvah of tzedakah. Okay, so better to give it as tzedakah than to sell it to a goy for a profit. Okay, well, what about when the Jew is not a tzedakah case? He's selling furniture, and his Baruch Hashem got a reasonable, good parnasa, and you can buy the same furniture somewhere else for a significantly lower price. So does that din of that which Rashi says you should buy miyada misecho, does that also have to be ready to pay a higher? We have to be ready to pay a higher price. So this is there are more. Although he takes that view, others challenge him on that. And what you have in front of you at the bottom of the page or the screen is a quote from the Sefer Ahavas Chesed. So you know the Chofetz Chaim published a Sefer Chofetz Chaim on Hilchos Lashon Hora. He published the Mishnah Brura, but he also published several other Sforim. One of the more well-known is the Sefer Ahavas Chesed, which is all about the laws of tzedakah. And so this comes in as a subsection within the Chofetz Chaim, within the Ahavas Chesed. So he talks about this, and this is in chapter Chelik Aleph, Perek Hey Sif Zayin, and he says, we're talking about selling. Even if the Kanani is ready to pay more for that article which you're selling, nevertheless, so now let's read it carefully. Even if the Kanani, which is a euphemism for any Nochri, if he's ready to pay a little bit more for it's ready to pay 110 pounds, and the Jew is ready to pay 100 pounds. Better sell it to 100 pounds for the Jew than to 110 pounds. I'm using this number as just a random example. And the same thing when it comes to purchasing. Better you should purchase from the same article from a Jew, even though you'll have to add a little bit more. Okay, so the Rov of Chaim has limited this mitzvah of of trading with a Jew rather than with someone else to, if it's going to cost you, but only a ma'at yoser, a little bit more. How to define a little bit, I'm sure that's going to be very relative. And although one of the contemporary poskim talks about the difference of a sikh, that's all very well for one-off purchase, and depending what it is, if it's purchase of a property for 500,000 or 600,000, it's a lot of money, etc. Or to sell it for that difference. Okay, so if it's in your perspective, if this is a small difference, then it's a mitzvah to sell to trade with a Yid rather than trading with someone else. Okay, let's move on to the next question, and that is, this is very very common. People have this minhag of not placing a bed with the feet to the door. And then people are asking sometimes, for whatever practical reasons, this seems to be the ideal position for the bed, but it is with the feet facing the door. So I want to tell you, first of all, that this is not written in any of the earliest Sfarim. This minhag of not having the feet of a bed facing the door is not mentioned in any earlier Sfarim. I did a search on the Otzar HaChochma. I came up with a couple of sources, very much contemporary sources, and this one is saying he's never heard of it from any of the poskim, and he thinks it might be because of tznius. But then we have another sefer which says the following: the reason why there is this minhag of not sleeping with the feet towards the door is also a minhag not to walk around the house in socks. And there's a third thing, is when one doesn't pour backhanded. And the reason is because these are all like a reminder of way one treats a dead person, dead body, that when the person has died, it would be the practice would be to take the body and put it on the ground, on the floor, and also, but they make that the feet are facing the door. And my father, Oliver Sholem, was actually very fussy about us not walking around the house just in socks. We had a Yiddish word. The Yiddish word is borfis. Why are we going around? Borfis is another word, barefooted. So he was very, very particular about that, and about the pouring. So if you pour backhanded rather than pouring forward, so then also that's one of the minhagim which are done when cleansing the body before burial. So apparently, I'm not personally involved in this department, but apparently this is one of the things that perhaps in some places they are particular to pour backhandedly, and therefore we are particular not to emulate those practices in our regular life, not to kind of invoke. You have this idea of al yiftach piv l'soton, do not open up the mouth for the soton. Oh, they're behaving like a dead person, as if to quote, I think Rabbi Vogel would say, to anticipate is to precipitate. Okay, so all right, so we avoid that. Coming back to the practical question, so if people do ask, so to dismiss this minhag, I'm not ready to dismiss it. It's a minhag Yisrael, even though it's not on record in earlier sources, but it is, in my mind, minhagim start off from the people and then they get into the books, rather than the other way around. So people ask this question, I would say, do take heed of it. But let's say if you put something in the way, could be a piece of furniture, could be a board or something, to put something as an interruption between your feet and the door, and that way you can be a bit more relaxed about this. Right, let's move on to the next question. So here I was asked about having music there are maybe like in events which are whether in camps or in schools, and unfortunately there are also amongst the children, and maybe those who are in the year of Oveilus, of mourning, who have lost a parent. And so the question is, are you allowed to have music in the camp when you're going to have some children who are in the year of Oveilus? And I sometimes get the impression people think that it's an aveira, it's like it's treif for them to have to hear music. It's not as rigid as that. Yes. So here you have a quote from the Sefer Nita Gavriel, a contemporary sefer, where he in his volume about Oveilus. So he writes this. He lives in America. I've met him many times. He writes, those who are spending the summer in the bungalow colonies or in camps, and it's common that they have in the dining room they have music playing. So they are also allowed to. Those who are in the year of Oveilus may also join the rest of the people, the kids, for lunch, and even though there's music from a tape recorder, etc. He says if there's a play or some kind of celebration, that's something they shouldn't join in. But otherwise, in other words, what he's basically saying is, if they're not going to a celebration, they're going to participate just in a camp, lunch, etc. And it happens to be that there's some music in the background. That is he says it's okay, you can ignore it. Now let's take a look in his note. So the first thing he says, "Bipi bala hero," and that's I think a significant expression. Now this he's saying is, well, he's heard this from previous Rabbonim, from earlier generations, that the approach would be more tolerant than intolerant about such a thing. And he explains the reason. He quotes the Ramar of Sheikh, which I did not look up, I'm sorry. He says the reason is because this is not a venue of celebration, it's not a venue of simcha, and therefore the Avelim are not obliged to leave the space in the middle of the meal. And it's not that they're playing the music, it's just happen to be in the dining room where there's some music in the background. Of course, they would not be allowed to join in dancing or something like that. But if there's background music, well, it could be on a school bus and a camp bus, so it's something which may be tolerated. Generally, I try to avoid dealing with Inyanim Oveilus on this program, but occasionally something else which is, I think, is worth sharing. So I got a call last week about someone who his sibling of his had passed away, and therefore he was, until the burial, he's called an oinen. After the burial, he would be going into Oveilus. Now there is a halacha that an Oveil in the week of Shiva may not trade, may not do melocha, as in parnosa, etc., earning. And it goes even so far, as you can see here on the screen, we have from Yidden, which is the laws of Oveilus, towards the end of Yidden, says the following, where you have two partners, and one of them became an Oveil, Rahman al-Islam, so then they'd have to close the shop. Even the other partner would not allow to continue doing trade, because the partnership, one of them is an Oveil, so the partnership, the shop would have to close down for the week. He says he can do. The partner is allowed to continue doing trade discreetly at home, but not in a public eye. So there is this idea that they wouldn't be allowed to, business would not be allowed to continue. Despite that, what's very common is that the Oveil, before, there's a moment of aninus, as I said, and then there's Oveilus. what's commonly done is, especially when there's a loss involved, that the Oveil or the Oinen would sell his interest, he'd sell his ownership to someone else who's not an Oveil, and it would then be public, put up a notice that due to bereavement, this shop is now under new ownership, and it has the name of the new owner, and that would be also wherever there'd be a notice that would be someone else would own it for the week. And so this is what the Nite Gabriel writes. There are those who have the custom that the Oinen would sell his shop or his business during the time of Aninus. In other words, and before the burial, therefore before the Aveilus has begun, before accepting Aveilus. And so then that way the business would be able to run. Of course, they won't be in the business. It all will happen without them being present. One should not allow this only only where there's a great need, and should ask a shalos chochem. So it should take rabbinic guidance, but I felt it was important that people should be aware of this. Number one, that there is an issur for the business to be open, business as usual, even if the Oveil won't be there. And the other thing, the other side of it, there is a solution of doing a formal sale of the interest. And that way, the business would be able to continue. Otherwise, there would be a significant loss. There is an excellent contemporary sefer on this whole area of Aveilus written by a colleague of mine, Dayan Levi Yitzchok Raskin, and towards the beginning, it's called a madrich. And towards the beginning of the sefer, he has two draft contracts, one in Hebrew, one in English, which would be a draft for drawing up an agreement for the sale of such an interest to avoid the problems of trading during the week of Shiva. Okay, let's move on a more happy note, and that is I was called by a good friend of mine who he has a new grandson. Now, he has been Sandek already once for one of the children, for one of these. In other words, this son has been a Sandek for an older child, but now my friend's father passed away recently, and he has every reason to believe that the newborn will be given his father's name. And so he was answering the question about whether it's appropriate for him to be Sandek again. Now, let's just discuss this. There is an ancient minhag, which is that one does not give the privilege of Sandek to the same person twice, unless it's a Rov in a city, but otherwise not. And this is relating to the union of Ketores. Now, the Ketores in the Beis Hamikdash, the burning of the incense in the Beis Hamikdash, was a privilege, and it says in the Mishnah that they would make a lottery. They would cast lots who is going to have the privilege of doing the Ketores this day. And they would say the words Chadoshim Liktores Boyu V'Hofisu. Whoever is new for Ketores, come forward and join in the lottery. And so the privilege of Ketores is limited to Kohanim in any case, but amongst the Kohanim themselves, so the privilege of Ketores was given to a person once in their life, so to speak. Of course, if there was no one else, they would do it again. But otherwise, it was something because it's seen as the Ketores would be a form of bringing the bracha of wealth to a person. And this is based on a pasuk, Borech Hashem Cheloi, Yasimu Ketoro V'Apecho. They will bring Ketores, and therefore they will Borech Hashem Cheloi. Hashem will bless his interest, his wealth. And so they wanted to share this bracha to as many people as possible. And therefore, the privilege of Ktoris was always given to a new person. What's that got to do with this, with a bris? Now, one of the early sources to this minhag of not giving Sandek twice is in the Maharil, lived about 600 years ago, possibly. And then the Noida Yehuda, who lived about 300 years ago, was a little bit dismissive to this, the severity of this minhag, or the strictness of this minhag. And a couple of generations later, the Chassam Sofer rejects the Noida Yehuda, and he upholds this minhag, and he explains what's the connection between Ktoires and a bris. So think of korbanos being a sacrifice. So then, if you see as korbanos as sacrifice, so what can be a greater form of sacrifice when one puts one's own child at risk to have the bris? I mean, there is an element of risk there. Certainly, there's pain there, and therefore the aspect of sacrifice does fit to the idea of a bris. And so, amongst korbanos, you've got various forms, and perhaps the purest form of korban would be the ktoris, whereas the others is meat, fat. Ktoris is a more subtle form of sacrifice. At any rate, there is a connection between the ktoris and a bris milah. Because of this, there is this minhag of seeing that the bris is a form of sacrifice, and it's also the one who is instrumental in doing the bris would have a bracha of wealth. And therefore, it's the minhag that one parent would not give the same person twice. Why a Rov in a city is different? Because the Kohen Gadol was able to do Ktoris more than once. If he chose to do Ktoris again and again, that would be okay. And therefore, a Rov, a Rebbe, whatever, would be honored to be Sandek again and again. I think I once told this before, that when Reb Chonya Morozov, when his second child, I think, was born, second son was born, and so he didn't give the Frierdiker Rebbe to be Sandek. So the Rebbe commented something to him. He says, "I think I'm not giving twice." So he says, that's if the Sandekos is a privilege for the Sandek. But if the Sandekos is a privilege for the child, then you can give the Sandekos a second time to the same person. I've heard that in Ger, every morning there's a lineup of babies, and the Ger Rebbe takes Sandekos one after the other. I presume it's not only the first child, but over again and again. So that's a minhag Yisrael to give a Rov in a Kehillah or Rebbe to give Sandekos more than once, but otherwise not. One more point about this before going further. The next question is that there is this minhag that we don't say tachnun when there's a bris. Now, there's two. We've also discussed this in the past. There's one aspect that if the moyo or the sandik or the avi haben are in shul, there's another aspect which is actually more basic, that the shul where the bris is going to take place, so one doesn't say tachnun, even if none of the celebrants are there. But if this is going to be this is the location where the bris is going to be taken, to be held presently, someone wouldn't say tachnun that morning. So I remember reading an article from Rav Ashkenazi, Allah Shalom, and he was taking this point, that since the bris is like a form of Ktoris, therefore the shul where the bris is going to take place is like become elevated like a Beis HaMikdash, where there's going to be the Ktoris, and because of that privilege, that's why Tachnun is not said. Let me just see, someone's asking a question. A father can act as Sandek for his children. The restriction is for others. I'm not sure. What I got, I'd have to look that up. This is clear that he says, "Ha'av atzmo lo yeshamish k'sandek etzel bonav yosim mipam echos." So this, he says clearly that even a father for his own children And that's in the Chassam Sofer. He says this point quite clearly, that he also shouldn't, the father of his own children shouldn't be Sandek twice. Right, this thing, sorry, in the notes which I've sent around, there's missing reference here. It's still from last week's. Right. I know that my mother, Al Shalom, she was born in Leningrad, but her family came from a town called Karalevitz. There were the Rov there, I think his name was Mendel Dubrovsky. There were very few Hasidic families there, and he didn't want to give, as a Rov, he didn't want to give Sandakos to one of the Balabatim, because then there will be jealousy. Why do you give him and not him? So he took the Sandakos himself several times, and unfortunately, there were several children which he had. The children did not survive, and it was seen as, you don't play around with this kind of stuff. And yeah, you hear Vasuras Tavis always. Okay, let's move on. Now, I want to go into a, should we say, a controversial topic. So, do you say Tachnun on Gimel Tammuz? Do you not say Tachnun? And of course, there are those who are so pained by the Rebbe's passing, which I fully understand. And therefore, they say, how can you see this as a day of celebration? How can you not say Tachnun on this day? Which I fully understand. And they ask, was Gimel Tammuz before Tov Nun Dalet? Was Gimel Tammuz a day that people did not say Tachnun? And why all of a sudden now you're going to say not saying Tachnun? Of course, the suspicion is you're doing it because you're thinking that there's reason to celebrate, whatever those ways of thinking are. But I just want to share something I think very valuable. So this is from the Rebbe's Rishimas, and it was said by in other words, the Rebbe, as a young man, he was writing down things which he heard from his father-in-law, from the Friedrich Rebbe. And this is on Tes Kislev in Tofresh Tzadik Gimel, which would be 1932. So Tes Kislev is a yortzeit of the Mittel Rebbe. So now I'm going to read this from the text. So the Rebbe said, my father-in-law, the Rebbe said, there is this inyan that Anash do say Tachnun on the yortzeit of the Rebbe's. For example, Chof Daled Teves, or Tes Kislev, which is the yortzeit of the Mittel Rebbe. Chof Daled Teves is the Alter Rebbe. Why is this? Now, this is very different to most other Hasidic groups. Most other Hasidic groups will not say Tachnun on a day of a Rebbe yortzeit. And in Chabad, it is said on the Rebbe yortzeit. And the background for that is, Ki Omer Hatzemach Tzedek, Demolt is good to beten. On a yortzeit, it's a good day to plead your case and to get forgiveness, etc. As a man geht rein auf a große Simcha, darf beten. And he's not denying that the yortzeit is a simcha. But if you are a poor man and there's a chasana, so you go around and you ask for donations. You ask for you do your schnorbit. Was man geht man. Darf beten. So there's an opportunity to ask because it's a simcha. Therefore, it's an opportunity to ask. Was man geht man. Whatever you may be given, you're given in any case. Maybe some things are given in any case. But if you ask for, then you're going to be given, and the Rebbe puts in brackets, mashmausa yosa harbe. If you ask for, so the merit of the day itself is a reason of abundance of goodness. The tzaddik is being elevated, and therefore he brings greater bracha. But if you ask for, then on this day, then you're given in a greater measure. So that's the word of the Tzemach Tzedek. On this, the Friedrich Rebbe added, it was evident by my father, the Rebbe Rashab, he was actually pleased if there would be no tachnun b'yortzeit. Just like in Baimer, it's minhag Yisrael, it's the yortzeit of Rashbi, and tachnun isn't said. So when there would be some, this way I understand, that if there would be, let's say, a bris or a chosin or something, there would be some side cause which would justify not saying tachnun. So if that would coincide with the yortzeit, then the Rebbe Rashab was pleased. So despite the reservation of the Tzemach Tzedek, despite the Tzemach Tzedek saying that the yortzeit is an opportunity to ask for, and therefore dafka to say tachnun, and despite that, the Rebbe Rashab, when there was a side issue which caused not saying tachnun, so he was actually pleased. So it's interesting. You have as I said, the Polish minhag is to skip tachnun because it's a yortzeit, and that's what we do. We also don't like babe. We don't say tachnun. Chabad do say tachnun, but if there is a side issue and therefore we're not saying tachnun, actually it's not something to be frowning about. It's something to be pleased about. So Gimel Tammuz. So was Gimel Tammuz a date of celebration before Tafshin Nun Dalet? So I'm told, I'm not one of those who keep track of everything. I'm told that by the Rebbe, by davening, if it was a Gimel Tammuz, the Tachanun was said. Equally, I'm told though, the Rebbe would have a farbrengen on a regular basis on Shabbos Mevorchim. Other days, other Shabbosim during the month, if there was an extra cause for celebration, so then there would be a farbrengen. So what I'm told, again, I haven't checked the facts, but I'm told that when Gimel Tammuz would be on the Shabbos, the Rebbe would farbrengen. So I'm not saying it's top, highest celebration in the Hasidic calendar, but it was a day of celebration, and there's many sichos, etc., saying, what Gimel Tammuz was when the Frierdiker Rebbe was commuted from a death sentence to exile. So it's from Moves to Chaim. So whichever way, there is reason for celebration. Also the one there's historically, and therefore, if people are pushing dafka not to say tachnun, I'm not going to make a fight about it, and I'm okay. So there is a basis for it. Okay, just like a somewhere in between the two extremes. Let's go on. So someone asks the question, as you can see here on the screen, we have a door and about 40 centimeters. Before the door, there's an archway. Now, this archway on its own does require a mezuzah. It's jutting out from all sides, and therefore it would require a mezuzah. The question is, does it require another mezuzah, since it's kind of leading to the next doorway? So can we see the two doorways as one, therefore not needed to have two mezuzahs? I did do a little bit of looking around. I remember seeing something. What you have here is from the Sefer Seichel Toy, which I've mentioned numerous times, specialist Sefer on mezuzah. And so you have this recurring question where you've got two doors, one beyond the other, or a wide doorway, and there is a source which to say that as long as there's not a difference of 4 tfochim between one and the other, then we should be able to see the two doorways as one. He writes here that this is apparently quite a common style in shops in Eretz Yisrael, in Yerushalayim, that you'd have like a door, and before that you'd have another set of doors, and between there'd be windows for a display, like a shop front. And he writes here that a particular shopkeeper who had such a two sets of doors, and he put up two mezuzahs because he thought perhaps in between is considered like a separate entity. And someone says it might be considered having two mezuzahs on the one door. And it might be seen as all just one doorway. So he asked Reb David Jungreis, who was the Rov of Anash, the Avestin. And for half a year, Reb David Jungreis would come regularly to the shop and thinking, yes, no. Eventually, he told him to put only one mezuzah on the inner end of the incline. So he came to the conclusion eventually that it's considered like one. And so back to that picture, if the area is, I didn't see there Dal Tfochim, that there is a Rashi, Menocha, something like that. But if it's such a small area, I'd be more inclined to say it doesn't require a mezuzah. If it be a deeper area, a wider area between the two, then there would be basis to put up a second mezuzah on the archway. Let's move on. So here I got a question this past week. And there's a woman who needs a carer. She's, as is very common, that they deny that they need the carer. They can manage without. If someone wants to come and help, okay, volunteer, not going to say no, but to start paying money, no, they're not ready to pay money for a carer. But the family feel that this person does need a carer, and therefore they hired a carer. They hired a close friend, and they're paying this close friend of the mother, and she's coming in very regularly, and they're paying her on the quiet. And the mother is very, very grateful. She's such a wonderful woman. My friend, she's so devoted. She comes in so regularly and makes the place so neat and prepares food, whatever. Very, very grateful. And now the carer is feeling very guilty because it's there's a how you say it's not true. She's being given all of these compliments and it's deception. And so she's asking, I think we have to tell the patient. I have to tell her that it's not for free. It's being paid for. So here's the question: are you allowed to keep to an untruthful story in order to benefit someone's welfare? Before reading the text inside, I just want to share with you a very well-known in Lubavitch. The Rebbe had a brother who lived in Liverpool for a little while. He lived in Tel Aviv, but he came for some kind of exchange. He was a professor. And then he died quite suddenly, I believe, at an early age. He was about 52 or something, or less. And the Rebbe's mother, after all she had lived through, and now was in America, in New York, and the Rebbe's brother, Label, he would write to his mother regularly. And the Rebbe was at first, the Rebbe was planning to come to England, or to Eretz Yisrael for the Levaya. And then he made the decision not to travel, because he didn't want his mother to discover that her son had died. And therefore the Rebbe stayed in New York and did all the arrangements remotely. And as we know, the Rebbe even would go every day to his mother during the Shiva, and he took his plimsolls, whatever, and painted them black, so she shouldn't notice that he's not wearing regular shoes. And then the Rebbe would write letters, very simple letters. How you do? Whatever the weather, whatever. Maybe. He would send letters. He copied his brother's handwriting. He would send the letters to England, and then someone in England would send them back to the Rebbe's mother onto President Street, as if the letter was coming from her son. Until the end of that, and that went on for about 13 years. Approximately, she passed away for 12 years, whatever. So the Rebbe kept up a deception, so that she should never be told. And perhaps she did suspect, but meanwhile, perhaps she was a very wise woman. Perhaps she did know, and she just played along. But meanwhile, I know that one of the Chassidim once came into the Rebbe, and the Rebbe was asking about when his father had passed away. And the Chassid mentioned, he asked the Rebbetzin, she was there. And he said he never wanted to ask her because by her bringing it up would be painful for her. So he never spoke to his mother about his father's passing. So let's come back. Well, that's a different story. But here we're talking about whether you can be untruthful in order to protect someone's welfare. So here we have, I was very exactly pleased to find a specialist sefer. As you know, I love these specialists for him. A specialist sefer about telling lies or not telling lies. So the sefer by someone called Nochum Yabrov, which he's got many other very good seforim called Divrei Sofrim. But this one is called Nivsa Fosoim, Hilchos Isur Sheker. A whole sefer devoted to which lies are allowed or which aren't allowed, etc. So we have a Gemara, Shabbos Daf Kuf Choftes, and it says, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchok said to his Talmid, to the Rabban, I plead with you, and the day where you have had bloodletting. Now, in times bygone, the times of Gemara, it was a very common thing to have a bloodletting, and it was seen as healthy. At the same time, it would be a day that you needed to have a boost of more energy, better food to replenish the lost blood, etc. So please, he says, on the day which you've had bloodletting, imru levataychu, tell your wives, Nachman iklu lagabon, tell them that Nachman as himself, that the Rosh Shiva is going to come, and that they should make a bigger feast as if I'm coming to have lunch with you. So he was telling them to tell, as we say in English, fibs. They're going to have a v'choshev guest, and then the wife would make a bigger feast. Now, in the Sefer Oirich Mishorim, not familiar with the Sefer, he says that the need for a meal on the day of bloodletting is a little bit of a pikuach nefesh, and therefore it was permitted for the Talmidim to say something which was untrue because it was vital that they should have this extra boost at the meal for their welfare. And then he writes, even without pikuach nefesh, if it's just an illness, also it's permitted to l'shanois b'shvilkach, to distort the facts a little bit would be permitted, and certainly in this case, coming back to our question, to say that the woman is a volunteer, to say that she's not, she volunteered to be a paid worker. That's okay. It's also a form of volunteering. But however you're going to play it, but it's vital for this patient, for the mother's welfare, that she should not know that the help is being paid for, and therefore it's justified in order to protect her welfare that one doesn't say the full truth. Let's move on. I don't know why this question came, but it came, we should discuss it. And that is when there's a wedding of a boy who's never been married before and a girl who's a Sula, so then there's 7 days of celebration. And then you have, let's say the wedding was on a Monday afternoon, so then the following Sunday will be the last of the 7 days of celebration. Let's say the meal started, like now is Sunday, now it's 10 to 9. Let's say the meal started now, and the meal continues at 10 o'clock, 10:15. Are you allowed to, or even until 9:30? Would you be allowed to say Sheva Brachos for the meal, which started within the 7 days, but finished after the 7 days are finished? Now, we know that Shalosh Shudas, which overflows into night, we'd say, if the Purim feast starts in the afternoon, and then it goes into after nightfall, we'll say Al Hanissim. So in many areas, we would say since the beginning of the meal was in the time where this component of benching was warranted, then it will also be included in the benching, even though that is after that time has finished. Notwithstanding that, here you have on the screen from the Sharet Shuva on Simon Kuf Peiches. So Kuf Peiches is the dinim of benching, and Sharet Shuva is one of the commentaries on the margins of the Shulchan Aruch and also in the Mishnah Brura, and he writes the following: the Kos of Beginas V'Radim, which is a sefer, I believe, from the Prima Godim, that even according to the poskim, who say that you'd include in benching according to when the meal began, that is true for Hazkara, as in Ritzei, as in Yalav Yavoi, as in Alanissim. So if the beginning of the meal was when those items were warranted, so then you'd include them in benching later. Perhaps we've discussed this before. If there's a chasana, let's say on Rosh Chodesh, and then it finishes part of Motzei Rosh Chodesh. So then you'd say Yalav Yavoi in benching. But if in the middle of the chasana you go out and daven Ma'ariv, so then once you daven Ma'ariv without Yalav Yavoi, so then you've cut off the flow and you wouldn't be able to say Yalav Yavoi in benching. At any rate, Aval B'Sheva Brachas the Chosin Shenimshach Sudas Yom Shvi Ad Leil Shmini. But if it's the seventh day, the feast on the seventh day overflowed into the eve of the eighth day. Vadai ein navorich sheva brachas. One should not say sheva brachas, and he gives a reference. Look up there, Ginas Vradim, and also Birkei Yosef. So that's for sure that we would not say sheva brachas after Shkia, because already then it's like a suffix already of the next day. So again, if the meal was started today being the seventh day, if the meal began now and it came 9:30, which is already after Shkia, we would not say Sheva Brachas. So we make sure to bench before Shkia and be able to say Sheva Brachas before Shkia. I just want to share with you something which I found quite remarkable. I was in Eretz Yisrael a couple of weeks ago for a wedding. A cousin made a wedding, and I saw something that they had dancing before the Chazon Kala came in, and then at a particular moment, the orchestra stopped playing music, and they made a hefsek for Ma'ariv, and everyone davened in the whole hall. There was no dancing, no serving. Everyone stopped and davened Ma'ariv, and then the chasna continued afterwards. A very beautiful chasna. I was very impressed with that. Instead of making all these huddles in the corridors, etc., all the men have to daven Ma'ariv. So then, why shouldn't it be a logical thing at a particular point? When the caterer, agree with the caterer, work it out, but put it on the program. If it's such a time where you start with the meal at day and you finish off at night, so then make a stop for 10 minutes, daven Ma'ariv, and then continue enjoying the chasana. I found that a fresh idea. I thought it's worth sharing. I'm going to finish off, and there's no references on the screen here, and that was that someone asked me that they noticed that last week in Manchester, Motzei Shabbos on the calendars was 10:59, and Chabad.org had 11:04. Give or take whatever it was. So he's asking, do we have to wait for the Chabad time, or can we finish off Shabbos with the earlier time? So I was involved with the timing aspect of Chabad.org, and therefore I want to explain what's going on here. According to the Alter Rebbe, once the sun has gone down approximately 6 degrees beneath the horizon, that is already what's called Tzeitzei Kechovim. Already 3 stars are visible, and it's called Nacht. There is something that's Gimel Kechovim Beinanim, 3 average stars are visible at that point. There's something which, for some things, we wait for Kechovim Ktanim, which means that smaller stars that have to be a greater degree of darkness to be able to see smaller stars. And that's a few minutes later. For Motzei Shabbos, we go even further, and we wait for Gimel Kechovim Retzufim, 3 stars which are near one another. I remember about 35 years ago, more, 35 years ago perhaps, approximately, whatever. I was in France, And this was before you had everything online. And it worked out, we were in a place called Briançon, just on the border of Italy. And I'd worked out the moment of the minute for Motzei Tisha B'Av. And I called over a couple of people. We were standing on the porch. I say, at 9:29, we'll be able to see 3 stars. At 9:28, we couldn't. 9:29, you could see there and there and there in 3 different parts of the sky. You could see 3 stars. And so that was the end of the fast. So that's 3 average stars, and they are scattered. For Motzei Shabbos, you have to wait until they are at Tzufim. The 3 stars are near one another, and that's obviously waiting for a greater degree of darkness. And that's related to the idea of what's called Tosfos Shabbos, that at the end of Shabbos, we add a little bit of the weekday to be annexed to the Shabbos, to add Kedusha, the overflow of the Kedusha of Shabbos into the weekday. Okay. How long? Now, then there was a Talmud Chacham who lived in Yerushalayim, the name of Rechiel Michal Tuchachinsky. And he introduced something which doesn't have a very strong background or basis, but he introduced a degree of 8.5 degrees. That 8.5 degrees, that's considered a Nacht for Motzei Shabbos, etc. So in London, and I think in most Frum communities, Motzei Shabbos is taken at 8.5 degrees. 8.5 degrees is actually, that's the, and when Chabad.org are posting times, so the default position, so that you have got the time what's called Tzesek HaChavim, which would have been, let's say, even 10 to 10, a quarter to 10, but the time for Motzei Shabbos, no, sorry, no, that's much too early. I'm talking about Manchester. At any rate, but there's a time for Motzei Shabbos, for Ma'ariv, for Tzesek HaChavim, considered Laila, and then the time for Motzei Shabbos, so the Chabad would normally display the times of 8.5 degrees. It looks like in Manchester, the 8.5 degrees is I mean, finishing off Shabbos at 10 past 11 or 5 past 11 is, you're in a sense, a very late time, and possibly, and I was told that they're using 8 degrees rather than 8.5 degrees, and therefore they had Motzei Shabbos, as I say, 5 to 11. What I want to say is that the 8.5 degrees is not a Lubavitcher minhag. It's not Lubavitcher Chumrah. It's Lubavitch kind of respecting the general local Hamish minhag of waiting for 8.5 degrees. In some places, as it looks like here in Manchester, because of the extreme, possibly in the height of summer, because of the extremely late time of which 8.5 degrees results, they have decided, I think, with wisdom, to make the end of Shabbos that little bit earlier, and that's perfectly okay to go along with it. Okay, I hope that has been informative. I wish you all a good evening, and I think next week I'm going to have to pre-record this year because I'll be involved in some event which is on Sunday evening in a Goethe shop. So be well, and we should meet in good health. Simchas Olam al Rishon.